At 11 in the morning, Mara Ellison was still a bride. At 12, she was an exhibit. The bell above the Red Willow Chapel struck noon with a blunt iron voice, and every blow traveled through the soles of her boots. The little church had been built on a rise, so that God, commerce, and public shame could all look down on the same dusty street. Mara stood beneath the porch roof in a dress that had taken her most of the winter to sew, watching the road from Everett Hale's Mercantile remain empty. The white cotton had looked almost fine by lamplight. Under the Arizona sun it showed every compromise. The lace bought second-hand from a widow, the narrow place at the waist where Mara had pieced two lengths together, the small uneven stitches made after midnight when her eyes watered from kerosene smoke. A red line of dust had already climbed the hem. She opened her father's watch. The case was scratched silver, warm from her palm. Gideon Ellison had carried it through 27 planting seasons, 3 droughts, and the fever that finally killed him. He had taught Mara that a clock was useful only when it helped a person decide what to do next. Everett was 1 hour late. The distance from his store to the chapel was less than half a mile. Even with his soft town boots and his dislike of heat, he could have crossed it in 10 minutes. Everett had never been late to collect interest. He had never been late when a freighter arrived with coffee, lamp oil, or bolts of Eastern cloth. He had never missed the hour written beside a debt. Mara closed the watch. Yesterday afternoon, a clerk from the territorial office had ridden out with notice that the final seal on Gideon's land patent would be delayed while the county reviewed an old boundary map. The delay did not threaten the claim itself. Gideon had paid every fee and filed every survey. But Everett had heard only one thing. The deed would not be in Mara's hand before the wedding. He had wanted the creek. The thought came without tears. It arrived cleanly, like the answer to a column of figures. The Ellison place lay 5 miles south of town, where a spring-fed creek crossed a strip of black soil before sinking into the red flats. In dry years, neighbors drove cattle there under agreements Gideon wrote in a careful square hand. Everett had spoken about the cottonwoods, the pasture, and the possibility of building a mill. He had spoken less often about Mara. She had mistaken his attention to her work for respect. Now she understood that he had only been measuring the property. Below the porch, people began to gather. They did not come close at first. They paused beneath the awnings of the assay office and the hotel, pretending to study notices or shake dust from their skirts. Then Lydia Harrow crossed the street with her black parasol open against the sun, and the rest followed as if summoned. Lydia was the wife of the bank president, and the keeper of every rule that benefited women like Lydia Harrow. Her gray dress remained free of dust because she had never carried a bucket farther than the length of a kitchen. She looked up at Mara with an expression carefully arranged to resemble sorrow. "My dear," she called. "Come inside. Reverend Price's wife will help you change." Mara did not answer. A fly worried the ribbon at her wrist. Somewhere behind the livery, a mule kicked a stallboard. The town waited for collapse with the patience of people watching weather approach. Lydia climbed one porch step, then stopped. "There is no kindness in prolonging this." "Whose kindness?" Mara asked. The question traveled farther than she intended. A few men shifted their weight. A woman covered her mouth. With a gloved hand, Lydia's face tightened. "Everett has evidently suffered a failure of courage. That does not require you to make a second mistake. Come down before the heat harms you." Mara looked past her toward the Mercantile. Its doors were shut. The front window, usually crowded with tin pans and patent medicines, had been stripped of its more valuable stock. "He took the cash box," a freighter said quietly. "Left before sunrise," another man answered. "North Road." Lydia heard them too. Her false sympathy hardened into something more useful to her. "You see," she said, "the matter is finished. You cannot return to that farm alone. The patent is unsettled. The taxes are due in October, and everyone knows Everett advanced money against the spring crop. The church can place you with a respectable family. Place me as a companion, perhaps, or a housekeeper. There is no shame in accepting what remains." "What remains?" Mara felt the words slide over her like dirty water. She thought of her root cellar. Peaches sealed under wax, sacks of beans, 3 rounds of hard cheese, onions braided from rafters. She thought of the south fence she had rebuilt after the flood, the mare she had delivered in sleet, the peach trees she had pruned while Everett stood under an umbrella and praised her unusual spirit. Nothing remained because nothing had been lost except a man who had never intended to stay. Lydia lowered her voice. A woman without a husband or a clear deed is vulnerable. You should be grateful that we are willing to prevent a scandal. Mara slipped the watch into a pocket hidden beneath her skirt. The seamstress had objected to the pocket. Brides, she had said, should not carry tools. I am not the scandal, Mara said. The street grew quiet. Lydia stared up at her. The man who promised to stand here and fled before dawn is the scandal. The people who came to watch me break are the scandal. I am only a woman standing in a dress. A flush rose from Lydia's throat to her cheeks. Pride will not feed you. No work will. You imagine the council will allow you to keep that land after this? Everett's contract gives him an interest. Magistrate Crowell can freeze the claim before supper. Then Magistrate Crowell had better sharpen his pencil. A nervous laugh escaped someone near the blacksmith's shop. Lydia turned, and the laugh died. You have always mistaken stubbornness for strength, she said. By tonight, no respectable door in Red Willow will open to you. Mara's corset pressed a rib with every breath. Sweat had soaked the cloth between her shoulder blades. She could feel the entire town willing her knees to fail. She fixed her eyes on the far ridge and counted what she could control. 4 porch posts, 12 steps, 36 nail heads visible in the floorboards, the watch at her hip. The weight of her body balanced evenly over both feet. She would walk home after the crowd, tired of waiting. She would cut herself out of the dress, water the mare, and read every line of Everett's contract. At dawn, she would ride to the county office. She would not surrender the creek because people with clean cuffs said she should. A wind moved across the square. It lifted dust from the wagon ruts and flung it against the crowd. Parasols dipped. Men turned their faces. Mara closed her eyes and let the grit strike her cheeks. Then the street fell silent in a different way. She opened her eyes. A horse was coming from the western road. The animal was a tall bay, broad through the chest, its coat darkened by sweat. It walked at an even pace, not hurrying for the crowd and not slowing for it. The rider wore a sun-faded canvas coat and a brown hat with the brim pulled low. His dark hair was tied at the nape of his neck. A coil of rawhide hung from the saddle horn, and a short-handled axe was strapped behind his leg. Mara knew him by sight. Jonah ran horses and cut timber in the high country north of Red Willow. He came into town perhaps 6 times a year, paid cash for salt and flour, filed his receipts, and left before men in the saloon gathered enough courage to insult him. Some called him an Apache rancher, as though the 2 words contradicted each other. Others called him worse when he was too far away to hear. Gideon had never done that. He had traded seed corn for 2 of Jonah's cured hides and once said, "That man knows the difference between silence and emptiness. Most folks here don't." Jonah guided the bay through the crowd. People moved without being asked. Even the blacksmith stepped aside. He stopped at the foot of the chapel stairs. The bay exhaled, sending dust around its forelegs. Jonah removed his hat. He did not look at Lydia Harrow. He looked at Mara. There was no pity in his face, no curiosity. His gaze rested on her with the grave attention. One worker gave another when a roof beam slipped and someone had to decide where to put a shoulder. "You planning to stay up there all day?" he asked. His voice was low enough that the crowd leaned forward to hear. "I had not decided. The heat will decide for you soon." Lydia recovered herself. "Mr. Nez, this is a private church matter." Jonah glanced at the gathered town. "Looks public." A murmur ran through the street. Lydia lifted her chin. "Miss Ellison is under the care of this community." Mara almost laughed. The sound would not come. Jonah set his hat on the saddle horn. "Is that what you call this?" Lydia's hand tightened around the parasol handle. "You have no standing here." "No," he said. "But I have a horse." He turned back to Mara and extended one gloved hand. The gesture was simple. It carried no claim, no promise, no demand that she trust more than the next minute. "You do not have to ride with me," he said. "But you do not have to stand there for them either." Mara looked at his hand. Everett's hands had always smelled of ink and pomade. He wore pale gloves when he visited the farm so dirt would not settle beneath his nails. Jonah's glove was cracked at the knuckles, dark with oil, repaired twice along the thumb. Lydia stepped onto the second stair. "Mara, if you leave with him, you will lose every protection this town can offer." Mara looked down at her. "You have spent an hour explaining that I have none." Lydia stopped. Mara gathered her skirt. Her legs trembled when she took the first step, not from doubt but from having stood too long in the heat. The boards creaked. The crowd drew breath as one body. At the bottom, Jonah did not seize her or lift her as though she were helpless. He held his hand steady while she placed one boot in the stirrup. When the dress caught, He turned his face away so she could free it without the town watching her embarrassment. She gripped the saddle horn, pushed with her left leg, and climbed behind him. The bay shifted once, then settled. Mara sat astride because side saddle was impossible in the heavy skirt. A line of her work boot showed beneath the white cloth. She thought of how horrified the seamstress would be and felt the first small loosening in her chest. Jonah handed her his hat. "You will need both hands," he said. She put the hat over her veil. It was too large and smelled of sun, cedar smoke, and horse. "Where are you taking her?" Lydia demanded. Jonah waited. Mara understood that the answer belonged to her. "Away from here," she said. Lydia's face went pale with anger. "The council will seize the Ellison land." Mara found the rear saddle strap and wrapped both hands around it. "Then they can explain in writing why they believe theft becomes law when 3 men sit at a table. You will be ruined." Mara looked at the woman who had come dressed to watch her collapse. "I was nearly married to Everett Hale," she said. "Ruined would have been staying." Jonah touched his knee to the bay's side. The horse turned. No one blocked them. They crossed the square at a walk. Mara kept her back straight. She did not look at the chapel, the mercantile, or the strip of road where Everett should have appeared. The white dress dragged across the horse's flank and gathered dust again. By the time they passed the last false front building, the bell tower had disappeared behind them. Only then did Mara breathe deeply. The breath hurt. Jonah did not turn. "There is a canteen tied under your left knee." She found it. The water was warm and tasted faintly of tin, but it loosened the dry knot in her throat. "You came to town for something," she said after several minutes. "Tax receipt. And found a wedding. I found a crowd." She looked at the back of his coat. "Why did you stop?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he would not answer. "Your father once crossed a flooded wash to bring medicine to my sister's boy," he said. He did not ask whether helping us would cost him standing. Mara had never heard that story. "Is that why?" "No." She waited. Jonah looked toward the clouds building above the northern ridge. "I stopped because they were enjoying it." The answer was so plain that it left no place for gratitude to become debt. The road began to rise. Red Willow flattened behind them, its buildings shrinking into pale blocks in the heat. Mara pressed the canteen against her lap. "I can go home. Not today." She stiffened. Jonah spoke before she could object. "2 riders left town on the south road while you were on the porch. One works for Crowell. The other works for Hale. If they reach your place first, they may inventory it in his name." Her heart struck hard once. "You saw them?" "I saw their saddlebags. County seals. Then we should ride there. The south road crosses Salt Wash. Last night's rain filled it. This horse can cross, but not before dark with 2 riders and a storm coming off the ridge." Mara looked north. The clouds had thickened, their undersides nearly black. "My cabin is 3 hours up," Jonah said. "Dry roof, locked door. At first light, we can decide what comes next." "We." The word frightened her more than the storm. Everett had used it to conceal ownership. "We should sell the lower field. We should let him handle the accounts. We would be safer if the deed were in his name." Jonah seemed to hear what she did not say. "You decide," he added. "I am telling you the ground." The first drop of rain struck Mara's hand. It was cold enough to sting. Within moments, the sky opened. Rain swept across the flats in a gray sheet, turning dust to slick clay. Jonah stopped the bay beside a stand of juniper and reached behind the saddle for a rolled blanket. He did not turn to wrap it around her. He passed it back. Mara shook it open. The wool was deep blue, dense, and heavy. She pulled it over the white dress and tucked the ends beneath her thighs. "Thank you." Jonah nodded once and urged the bay toward the mountains. The flat country ended quickly. Beyond a line of greasewood, the trail narrowed into stone and wet roots. The bay climbed with its head low, placing each hoof as carefully as a carpenter set a joint. Mara had ridden since childhood, but never in a soaked wedding dress, and never without her own saddle. The wet skirt pulled at her hips. The corset would not allow her to lean forward enough on the steepest grades. When the horse stepped over a fallen pine, Mara slipped. Her hand shot forward and struck the back of Jonah's coat. He stopped the horse at once. "I am caught," she said. The hem had twisted around a buckle beneath her right knee. Jonah dismounted. He stood on the uphill side and studied the tangle without touching her. "Can you lift the cloth?" She gathered the wet layers. He freed the lace from the buckle with 2 fingers, careful not to drag his hand along her leg. Then he stepped back. "You should cut it," he said. "I sewed it. That is not a reason to let it pull you off a mountain." Mara looked down at the dress. 3 months of work ruined by an afternoon. Yet the thought of cutting it did not hurt as much as she expected. "Do you have a knife?" He handed her one hilt first. Mara sawed through the lower 2 feet of the skirt. Wet cotton resisted, then tore with a sound like brush burning. She cut all the way around, leaving the lace in a pale heap beside the trail. Wind lifted one strip and carried it into the junipers. Jonah watched it go. Lighter? Considerably. She returned the knife. He mounted and they continued. Rain became sleet near the first ridge. The drops clicked against Jonah's hat brim and gathered as ice along the blanket's edge. Ponderosa pines closed around them, their trunks dark with water, their bark smelling of vanilla and pitch. The air changed. It no longer carried dust, manure, and hot boards from red willow. It smelled of wet stone, cold needles, and soil opened by rain. Mara's hands gradually stopped shaking. They crossed a narrow creek where runoff foamed around black rocks. Jonah spoke only when the trail required it. "Lean left. Keep your heel clear. Hold the horn here." He never praised her for obeying, and never repeated himself when she understood. They moved as two people solving the same difficult problem. At dusk, the trail crested into a meadow. A cabin stood at the far edge beneath tall pines. It was built low and square, with a stone chimney, a deep porch, and a roof weighted by peeled logs. A barn and corral sat downhill where the ground leveled. Nothing about the place was decorative. Everything had a purpose, and everything appeared maintained. The bay stopped beside the porch. Jonah dismounted. He tied the reins, then moved away so Mara could climb down without being caught unless she asked. Her feet reached the ground and her knees failed. His hand closed around her elbow. It was there only long enough to keep her upright. "Thank you," she said. He released her. Inside, the cabin was cold but dry. Jonah lit a lamp, then built a fire in the iron stove with cedar curls and split pine. The room emerged in amber light. One table, 2 chairs, shelves of jars, a narrow bed, a washstand. A rifle hung high over the door. A stack of folded blankets rested in a cedar chest. Hooks along the wall held tools, bridles, and winter coats. The floor had been swept recently. Mara noticed a second cup beside the coffee tin. Jonah set a bucket of water near the stove. "There is food in the pantry. Dry clothes are in the chest. The latch works from inside. Where will you sleep?" "The barn." She looked at the rain beating the window. "You own the bed. Tonight, you need the door." The sentence silenced every polite protest she might have made. He took a bedroll from beneath the table and crossed the threshold. Before leaving, he placed the key on a peg beside the door. Mara stared at it. "You are giving me the key? It is your room until morning. What stops me from taking your rifle and your horse?" Jonah considered her. "You do not mistreat horses." The answer was not naive. It was a judgment based on what he had seen. He stepped outside and pulled the door closed. Mara slid the heavy latch into place. The sound of iron entering iron traveled through the room. She stood with her palm against the wood, listening for him to pause on the other side. His boots crossed the porch and continued toward the barn. Only then did she begin to tremble. The shaking came from cold, exhaustion, and the delayed violence of the day. She stripped off the wet dress. The corset laces had swollen tight. She worked at them until her fingers cramped, then used Jonah's knife to cut through 2 bill cords. When the stays loosened, air entered her lungs so suddenly that she bent over the washstand. She remained there, breathing. On the floor behind her lay what was left of the wedding dress. Red at the hem, gray with rain, stiff bodice collapsed inward. It looked less like a shroud now than a dead thing that had never belonged to her. The cedar chest held a clean flannel shirt, canvas trousers, wool socks, and a folded length of cloth that could serve as a belt. The clothes were Jonah's and far too large. Mara put them on anyway. She rolled the sleeves and tied the trousers at her waist. The wool socks covered the blisters raised by her wedding boots. She heated water and washed the dust from her face, neck, and arms. The basin turned pink, then brown. She scrubbed until the skin over her collarbone stung. Hunger arrived as an ache. The pantry contained cornmeal, dried beans, onions, salt pork, flour, chicory, and jars of chokecherry preserves. Mara cut salt pork into a skillet and added an onion. Fat snapped against the iron. The smell filled the cabin, simple and rich. She stirred cornmeal into boiling water and made a thick mush, then found 2 plates. She stopped. Jonah was in the barn. Mara looked at the second plate for a long moment. Leaving food outside would be kindness. But it might also be an invitation he had taken care not to request. She covered the plate with another tin dish, opened the latch, and stepped onto the porch. Rain had softened to sleet. Light glowed through a crack in the barn door. She carried the plate across the yard. Mud sucked at her borrowed boots. Inside, the bay stood in a stall beneath a blanket. Jonah was rubbing its forelegs with a coarse cloth. His coat hung from a peg, and his shirt was dark with rain across the shoulders. He looked up when Mara entered. "I made too much," she said. He glanced at the covered plate. It was an obvious lie. He accepted it as the boundary she needed. "Set it there." She placed it on an overturned crate. "You cannot sleep in this cold," she said. "I have before. That does not make it sensible." "No, then come inside." Jonah resumed rubbing the horse's leg. "You locked the door. I can unlock it." He was quiet. Mara understood then that he was not waiting for courtesy. He wanted certainty. "You may sleep by the stove," she said. "The bed remains mine. The door stays latched. You do not cross the room after the lamp goes out unless the cabin is burning." Jonah met her eyes. Agreed. He finished with the horse before touching the meal. They returned to the cabin separately. Mara first and Jonah several minutes later. He laid his bedroll beside the stove, removed his wet boots, and sat cross-legged to eat. He did not ask about Everett, the patent, or why Mara had nearly married a man she now called a coward. Mara ate at the table. The arrangement was strange but not uncomfortable. The stove ticked as its iron expanded. Wind pressed at the walls. Jonah finished every bite, washed his plate, and put it away. "You cook well," he said. The compliment was direct and free of flattery. "You were hungry. That can improve bad food. It cannot create good food." Mara almost smiled. Almost. She set her father's watch on the table and wound it. The ticking filled the space between them. Jonah looked at it. Gideon's? Yes, he was precise. He was afraid of owing people. Wise fear. Mara turned the watch over. "Did you know him well?" "Well enough to disagree." "What about water?" That surprised her. "My father was generous with the creek." "He was generous once," a man asked correctly. "I told him water does not care how a request is phrased." "What did he say?" "That fences do." Mara could hear Gideon saying it. The corner of her mouth moved before she stopped it. Jonah noticed and looked back at the fire. She wanted to ask about his sister's boy, about the flood, about why her father had never told her. But the day had stripped her down to the last layer of endurance. Questions could wait. She took the lamp to the bed. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Mara." Everett had called her darling before he called her by name. Hearing her name spoken without ownership felt unexpectedly intimate. She lay beneath heavy furs. Jonah remained by the stove, his back against the wall, his hat tipped over his eyes. The door was locked, the rifle was above it, the fire held steady. Mara listened to the watch until sleep took her. At dawn she woke to the scrape of metal. For one startled second, she did not know where she was. Then she saw Jonah kneeling at the stove, opening the firebox. Pale light outlined his shoulders. "You are awake," he said. "So are you. I slept. You sat against a wall. I have slept in worse places." Mara pushed aside the blanket. The room was cold enough that her breath showed. She crossed the floor and crouched beside the stove. The ash box was nearly full. Jonah reached for the shovel. "I can clear it," she said. He handed her the tool. No argument, no performance, no warning that soot would stain her hands. Mara scraped ash into the zinc bucket while Jonah split thin kindling with a small hatchet. They worked in silence. She cleared the draft holes. He built the fire. When flame took, he set a pot of water on top and ground roasted chicory root. The bitter smell warmed the room before the stove did. He poured 2 cups. Mara wrapped both hands around hers. "When do we go to my farm?" "Not yet." Her shoulders tightened. Jonah took a folded paper from his coat and placed it on the table. It bore the county seal. "I found this nailed to my barn door before sunrise," he said. Mara opened it. The notice claimed Everett Hale had petitioned Magistrate Crowell to preserve his marital interest in the Ellison property. It ordered Mara to present herself before the county office within 10 days or risk judgment in her absence. At the bottom, a handwritten line authorized an inventory of livestock and stored goods for protection against waste. Mara read it twice. "He is not even in town," she said. "He does not need to be if Crowell is willing to act for him. He abandoned the ceremony. The paper says delay, not abandonment. He emptied his store. The paper does not mention that." She set the notice down. Anger moved through her with a steadiness colder than fear. They will take the mare, if they can reach her. The south road, Saltwash, is still high. The riders who left yesterday turned back. "I saw their tracks below the ridge." Mara looked up. "You rode out before dawn?" "To check. You could have told me. You were sleeping." The simple answer irritated her because it carried no desire to be thanked. "We go today," she said. Jonah drank his chicory. The county office will be closed for 2 days. Crowell went to Pine Wells for a land auction. How do you know? His clerk talks when frightened. Mara paced once around the table, the borrowed trousers dragged at her heels. I cannot sit here while they write my life in their books. No, she stopped. No, you cannot. Then why are you so calm? Because anger is useful after you choose where to put it. Mara looked at the notice again. I need the contract. It is in my father's desk. I need his tax receipts, survey notes, and correspondence with the land office. Can you prove the marriage agreement depended on the deed being transferred? I think so. Everett insisted on a clause about the property becoming joint upon solemnization. Gideon refused to give him any interest before the ceremony. Then the ceremony matters. Yes, Crowell will argue intent matters more. Crowell will argue whatever Everett paid him to argue. Jonah nodded. So we need more than anger. Mara sat. Outside, thawing ice fell from the roof in small crashes. Do you know the law? She asked. I know what men with offices use when they want land. That was not my question. I can read statutes. Where did you learn? At Fort Grant. Translating contracts for men who assumed I could not understand them. There was no pride in the answer and no shame. Mara folded the notice along its original crease. Will you help me retrieve the papers? Yes. Why? Because Crowell is trying to turn your absence into consent. That is not your burden. No. Jonah set down his cup. It is my choice. The distinction settled between them. Mara looked at the soot in the lines of her palms. Then we wait for the wash to fall. We work while we wait. He rose and opened the door. Morning flooded the cabin. Beyond the porch, the world had been washed clean. Patches of sleet shone beneath the pines. The meadows steamed where sun touched it. The bay called from the barn. Mara stepped outside in Jonah's oversized clothes and breathed air sharp enough to hurt. The mountain did not know she had been abandoned. For the first time, that felt like mercy. Work began with the horse. Jonah led the bay into the yard and handed Mara a currycomb. The animal's winter coat was lifting in damp clumps along its shoulders. Mara worked from the neck backward, using small circles to loosen dried mud without pulling the skin. The bay turned its head once, sniffed the borrowed shirt, and relaxed. His name? She asked. Cedar. He carried us well. He knows the trail better than I do. Jonah inspected a split in the rear cinch. The leather had not broken, but several stitches had pulled loose during the climb. He carried the strap to a bench inside the barn and set out an awl, waxed thread, and a lump of rendered tallow. Mara finished with cedar and watched from the stall door. You sew leather? Jonah asked. I repair harness. He moved aside. The invitation was not phrased as a test, but it felt like one. Mara sat at the bench. The cinch was thick and stiff with age. She rubbed tallow into the damaged section, warmed it between her palms, then pushed the awl through the old holes rather than weakening the leather with new ones. Jonah threaded the needle and handed it over. Mara made a saddle stitch, pulling each pass even. Halfway through, the thread snagged. She worked it free without cursing. Gideon taught you? He asked. He said a broken strap waits for the steepest hill. He was right. You disagreed with him often for a man who quotes him. Men can be wrong about water and right about leather. The answer came so dryly that Mara looked up. Jonah's face had not changed, but something near his eyes had. She returned to the strap before he saw her smile. When the repair was finished, he tested it with both hands. Strong. Mara wiped tallow from her fingers. It will hold until spring, then replace the whole length. He nodded, accepting instruction in his own barn without offense. Afterward, they cleared a garden bed south of the cabin. Frost had not yet locked the soil, but juniper roots had invaded from the edge. Jonah gave Mara a mattock and took a shovel. She swung until her shoulders burned. Each root that tore free released the smell of wet earth and bitter resin. She imagined Lydia Harrow's face. She imagined Everett counting cash while she waited beneath the bell. The next blow split a root cleanly. Jonah worked at the opposite end and did not tell her to slow down. He understood that some anger needed weight and resistance before it could become thought. By noon, they had cleared half the bed. Mara sat on a border stone, breathing hard. Jonah brought water and a heel of bread with dried venison. He placed both beside her and returned to sharpening the shovel. You could sit, she said. I am sitting. He was crouched on his heels. That does not qualify. On this mountain it does. She ate. The bread was dense enough to repair a wall. Did you make this? Yes. You used too much flour. Jonah examined the shovel edge. It keeps longer so. Would a stone? He looked at the bread in her hand, then at her. Mara waited for offense. Instead, he said, You may make the next loaf. I intend to. That afternoon he showed her the spring house, root cellar, smoke shed, and the small field where he grew corn, beans, and squash together. He did not present the ranch as a possession meant to impress. He explained what failed in drought, where snow drifted, which roof beam needed replacement, and how wolves tested the north fence every January. The honesty calmed her. Everett had shown her a life made of finished pictures, a polished parlor, imported curtains, a place at his store counter where she would keep books under his name. Jonah showed her leaking joints and weak fence posts, problems she could trust. By evening, Mara had shaped dough in a wooden bowl. Jonah watched from the table as she kneaded. "You are strangling it," he observed. "I am developing the gluten. It looks afraid. It will be grateful later." He returned to repairing a bridle. The dough rose near the stove while Mara made bean stew with onion and dried chile. She cut the new loaf too soon. The crust cracked, and the knife struck the dense heel at an angle. The heel shot across the table, landed in Jonah's cup, and sent chicory over his sleeve. Silence filled the cabin. Mara stared at the floating bread. Jonah looked down at his wet cuff. "I can explain," she said. "Can you?" "No." He lifted the bread from the cup. A black stream ran from it. Mara's control broke. The first laugh hurt. It came out as a rough gasp, then another. She put both hands on the table and bent forward, laughing until tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. Not the tears Red Willow had wanted. These came from the absurdity of bread and chicory, from exhaustion, from the sight of Jonah Nez holding a dripping heel as solemnly as a court exhibit. He watched her. Then his mouth changed. It was not a broad smile. Only one corner lifted, brief and reluctant. Yet it transformed his face enough that Mara laughed harder. "The loaf attacked first," he said. "You insulted it. I questioned its courage. It defended itself. Jonah set the bread on his plate. Then I respect it." That night the cabin felt less like borrowed shelter. They still kept distance. Jonah's bedroll remained near the stove. Mara kept the bed and the key, but silence no longer served only as a wall. It became room enough for two people to work, eat, and rest without performing. The next morning salt wash had fallen. They left before sunrise. Mara wore her shortened wedding boots, trousers, the flannel shirt, and the indigo blanket beneath a borrowed coat. She tied her hair back with a strip cut from the ruined dress. The white cloth against her dark braid felt like private joy. Jonah rode Cedar. Mara rode a compact gray mare named Juniper, steady-footed and unimpressed by everything. The trail down the mountain was slick. At the wash, brown water still moved fast between the banks, carrying branches and foam. Jonah crossed first, angling Cedar upstream. Mara followed. Water rose to Juniper's belly and pulled hard at her legs, but the mare held. On the far side, they paused beneath cottonwoods. "If riders are at the farm?" Mara asked. "We see them before they see us, and if they have already entered? You decide whether we approach." Mara checked the small revolver Jonah had loaned her. "I know how to use this. I assumed you did." They left the road a mile from the Ellison place and followed a cattle path through mesquite. Mara's chest tightened when the cottonwoods around the creek came into view. Home. The cabin roof looked intact. Smoke did not rise from the chimney. The barn door stood open. 2 county horses were tied to the fence. Jonah dismounted in the shelter of a low ridge. "Wait here," Mara said. "It is my house." "Yes. I go first, yes," she had prepared to argue. His agreement steadied her more than resistance would have. Mara approached through the orchard with the revolver beneath her coat. Fallen peaches had fermented in the grass, sweet and sour. The kitchen door hung open. Inside, drawers had been pulled out. Flour lay across the floor in white drifts. Her father's desk had been forced, and the small cash drawer was gone. A man in a county coat emerged from the bedroom, carrying Gideon's survey case. He stopped when he saw Mara. "Well," he said, "Miss Ellison." His name was Pruitt. He served notices, collected taxes, and supplemented his income by frightening widows. "Put that down," Mara said. Pruitt glanced at her clothes. "You look comfortable." The second man came from the pantry with a jar of preserves in one hand. Mara recognized him as Everett's clerk, Niles. "Mr. Hale asked us to secure property subject to waste," Pruitt said. "You entered without a judgment. We have an inventory order. An inventory does not permit removal." Pruitt looked toward the window. "You alone?" Mara raised the revolver. His expression changed. "I asked you to put down the survey case." Niles set the preserves on the table. Pruitt did not lower the case. "Pointing a gun at an officer is a serious matter. So is burglary. You abandoned the property. I was gone one night with an Indian. The word was intended to injure and to provoke. Mara kept the barrel level. A shadow crossed the doorway behind him. Jonah stood outside, not entering. Pruitt turned slowly. Jonah's hands were empty. That made him more frightening, not less. I was asked to wait, he said. Mara almost turned to look at him. She did not. Pruitt placed the survey case on the desk. Both of you step onto the porch, Mara said. Niles obeyed first. Pruitt followed, muttering about warrants and obstruction. Jonah moved aside to give them room. You will leave the horses, Mara said. Pruitt stared. Those belong to the county. You use them to carry stolen goods. You may retrieve them after Magistrate Crowell signs a statement listing every item you removed. We have removed nothing. Mara nodded toward the bulge beneath Niles's coat. Empty your pocket. Niles produced 2 silver spoons and a small jar of salve, swore under his breath. Mara's anger sharpened into satisfaction. Now I have a witness. To what? To the difference between inventory and theft. She made them walk to the road. Pruitt turned once. Crowell will hear of this. I am counting on it. They left on foot, their boots sinking in the wet road. Only when they disappeared beyond the cottonwoods did Mara lower the revolver. Her arm shook violently. Jonah remained by the porch. You waited, she said. You asked. I might have needed you. You would have said so. Mara looked into the house at the flour, broken desk, and open drawers. They were in my father's room. Jonah did not offer comfort shaped like a command. He waited. She stepped inside. The damage was not great, but every disturbance felt intimate. Gideon's shirts had been pulled from the chest. His shaving cup lay broken. Papers covered the floor. Mara crouched among them and began sorting. Tax receipts, seed invoices, letters from the surveyor, a copy of the marriage agreement. She unfolded it on the table. The clause was there. Upon legal solemnization and not before, the Ellison property would become subject to joint management. Gideon had underlined legal solemnization twice. Mara exhaled. Useful? Jonah asked from the threshold. Very. She opened the survey case. The patent application, original plat, federal payment stamp, and correspondence were intact. They had not looked inside yet, she said. Pruitt does not read unless paid extra. A laugh almost came. The house stopped it. Mara looked toward the barn. I need to check the animals. Her mare had been moved to a back stall but was unharmed. The hens had scattered. One water trough had been overturned. Jonah repaired the hinge while Mara fed and watered everything. They worked until the place looked occupied again. Near sunset, Mara found Gideon's ledger beneath a loose floorboard under his desk. She had forgotten he made a hiding place there after a series of thefts during the drought. The book was thick, its leather cracked. Inside were 20 years of entries. On the final page, beside a note recording Everett's proposed marriage settlement, Gideon had written, Hale asks for authority before he has earned trust. Mara sees good because she possesses it. I fear he will mistake that for weakness. Patent belongs to her alone. No transfer without completed marriage and her separate written consent. Below it was the signature of Amos Bell, the retired federal surveyor who had witnessed the discussion. Mara read the passage twice, then sat in her father's chair. For months, she had believed Gideon approved of Everett. He had died before the wedding date was fixed. She had taken his silence for consent. He had seen the danger. The discovery did not bring relief alone. It brought grief back with full weight. Mara pressed her thumb against the ink where Gideon's pen had paused. The page blurred. Jonah stood in the kitchen, giving her the room while remaining close enough that she was not abandoned inside it. I thought he trusted my choice, she said. He trusted you. He thought I was wrong. Both can be true. She closed the ledger. I wish he had told me. So do I. The answer held no attempt to explain a dead man's reasons. Mara wiped her face with the heel of her hand. We take everything to the mountain. All of it. The patent papers, contract, ledger, receipts. Food. Winter clothes. The mare. Anything Pruitt might call abandoned. Jonah looked outside at the failing light. It will take 2 trips, then we make 2. Not tonight. The wash rises after dark. Mara wanted to fight him simply because the day had taught her to expect control. But he was not forbidding. He was describing water. We stay here, she said, if you choose. It is my house. Yes. You sleep in the main room. He nodded. They ate canned peaches and cold biscuits because Mara could not bear to cook in the disturbed kitchen. Jonah repaired the desk lock while she sorted papers into oilcloth. Before bed, Mara stood on the porch. The farm lay silver beneath the moon. The creek moved through reeds. Beyond the fields, red willow's lights glimmered faintly. I used to think distance meant safety, she said. Jonah leaned against a porch post. Sometimes it does. Not enough. No. They entered because they believed no one would object. You objected. They will come again. Yes. Mara glanced at him. You never soften the truth. It does not become softer because I hide it. Everett hid every sharp edge until he needed one. Jonah looked toward the creek. Then he was not preparing you for a life. He was preparing you for surrender. Mara's hand closed around the folded notice in her pocket. I will not give it to him. I know. How? You cut your wedding dress before you let it pull you from a horse. The moonlight caught the pale strip tied in her hair. For the first time since the chapel, Mara felt something stronger than survival. She felt believed. They left at dawn with the documents wrapped in oilcloth, 2-pack saddles loaded with food and clothing, and Mara riding her own chestnut mare, Belle. Jonah led the pack horse. He did not ride ahead as rescuer or behind as guard, he rode beside her. At Salt Wash, the water had dropped another foot. Mara guided Belle into the current first. They reached the mountain ranch before the next storm. For 2 days, they turned the cabin into a place that held traces of both lives. Mara's oilcloth bundles went beneath the bed. Gideon's ledgers occupied the lower shelf beside Jonah's grazing records. Her cast-iron skillet hung from an empty peg. A blue enamel cup with a chipped rim joined the 2 tin mugs by the water barrel. Nothing was discussed as permanent. That made each small arrangement feel more honest. Mara baked bread that could be cut without violence. Jonah replaced the loose hinge on the pantry door. Together they salted strips of venison, rendered tallow, and covered the garden bed with pine needles against the coming frost. He showed her how to twist yucca fiber into cord. She showed him a better way to seal preserve jars with beeswax and cloth. Their days developed a rhythm without becoming predictable. One morning Jonah returned from checking traps with a canvas sack of dried rabbit brush blossoms and black walnut hulls. For dye, he said. Mara opened the sack. The plants released a dry, sharp scent. You gathered all this? Before the freeze. For what wool? He nodded toward the barn loft. There she found 3 fleeces, cleaned but unspun. Jonah had traded for them in spring and intended to make horse blankets. The work would take weeks. They built a dye fire outside because the walnut hulls stained everything they touched. Mara filled an iron kettle with water and crushed plant matter. Jonah fed split wood beneath it. Steam rose dark and bitter, clinging to their clothes. When the liquid turned the color of strong tea, they lowered the first bundle of wool into the pot with wooden paddles. Not too fast, Mara said. You will felt it. Jonah slowed. You take instruction better than most men. Most men do not want a blanket. She glanced at him. Again, that almost smile near his eyes. By afternoon, the wool had taken on a deep rust brown, the color of wet canyon walls. They spread it over a rack to dry. Wind moved through the fibers. Mara stood with her hands on her hips. It will make a good blanket, or a coat. For whom? Jonah adjusted one corner. Winter has not decided. The answer stayed with her. That evening, while Mara rolled biscuit dough, hoofbeats sounded below the meadow. Jonah was at the door before she set down the rolling pin. He did not reach for the rifle. He listened. 1 horse, he said, moving poorly. A rider appeared at the edge of the clearing, hunched against the cold. It was Owen Price, the Reverend's 17-year-old son, soaked through and breathing hard. He slid from the saddle and nearly fell. Mara opened the door. Owen stared at her clothing, then quickly looked away. Miss Ellison. Mr. Nez. What happened? She asked. He pulled a sealed envelope from inside his coat. A man paid me to bring this. I did not know who it was from until after I left town. The envelope bore Everett Hale's name. Mara did not touch it at first. Where is he? Jonah asked. Pine Wells, I think. Maybe farther north. Folks say he is coming back with a lawyer. Why did you ride in this weather? Mara asked. Owen flushed. My mother said you had been taken. Mrs. Hale said worse. I wanted to see. And? The boy looked around the warm cabin, the bread dough, the stacked documents, Jonah standing several feet from Mara with his hands visible. I think they lied. Mara took the envelope. She fed Owen stew, wrapped him in a blanket, and made him sleep near the stove while his horse dried in the barn. Only after the boy's breathing deepened did she break the seal. Everett's letter filled 4 pages. He wrote as though the chapel had been an unfortunate misunderstanding. He claimed business had forced him to depart suddenly. He accused Mara of damaging his reputation by leaving town with Jonah. He declared the marriage agreement binding in spirit and demanded that she return within 5 days to complete the ceremony. The final paragraph contained the truth. If she refused, he would petition the territorial court for control of the Ellison property. as compensation for expenses incurred in anticipation of marriage, including store credit, improvements, gifts, and lost commercial opportunity. Mara read the list of improvements. A new pump handle Gideon had paid for. Fence wire Mara had purchased with peach money. A plow Everett once offered to sell at twice its value, which she had refused. He had converted every conversation into a debt. Jonah sat across from her at the table. What does he ask? For me to return and marry him. Will you? No. The answer came before anger. Jonah's gaze remained steady. Then we answer the claim, not the man. Mara spread Gideon's ledger, the contract, and the county notice across the table. Crowell will support him. Crowell is county authority. The patent is federal. The federal registry is in Prescott. 3 days by horse in good weather. Amos Bell lives in Pine Wells? Mara looked up. He did when Father wrote this. The witness. Yes, if he is alive. We find out. You say that as though roads open because you decide to use them. No. Jonah touched the edge of the county notice. Roads remain difficult. We go anyway. Mara studied the quiet certainty in his face. She felt the old fear rise, the fear of owing, of accepting help that would later be renamed obligation. What will this cost me? She asked. Jonah did not pretend not to understand. Food for the horses, he said. Time. A new shoe for Juniper if the North Trail stays rocky. I mean, what will you ask from me? Nothing. No one gives this much for nothing. Then do not call it giving. What should I call it? He looked toward Owen asleep by the stove, then back at her. Standing beside someone. Mara's throat tightened. That is still a choice with a price. Yes? And you are willing to pay it? Yes? Why? Jonah was silent for a long time. Because a town full of people decided your life could be divided without asking you, he said. I know that arithmetic. The answer opened a door in the room that neither of them crossed. Mara folded Everett's letter and placed it in the stove. The paper curled inward, his name blackened first, then the demand, the accusation, and the threat became ash. The postmark might matter. Owen woke before dawn. He ate biscuits and took a packet back to his mother. Before mounting, he hesitated. Miss Ellison? Yes? I am sorry I watched yesterday. Mara knew what he meant. The chapel, the crowd. Next time, she said. Decide sooner whether you are watching or helping. The boy nodded. He rode away through frost. Mara stood beside Jonah at the corral until the sound of hooves disappeared. When do we leave for Pine Wells? She asked. Tomorrow. What do we do today? Jonah handed her an axe. Prepare for winter. Mara took it. The work of defending her future would begin with split wood, fed horses, dry wool, and a roof that did not leak. The law might decide which paper carried authority. But the mountain had already begun teaching her another kind of ownership. It was measured in what a person maintained, what she refused to surrender, and who remained beside her when there was no crowd to applaud. The axe bit into pine just below the knot. Mara pulled it free, adjusted her stance, and struck again. The log split down the center with a sharp report. One half rolled from the stump and landed in frost. Jonah gathered the pieces without comment. They worked until the woodpile reached the lower edge of the cabin window. Preparing for a journey did not suspend the needs of the ranch. Water barrels had to be filled. Animals needed extra hay. The smokehouse latch had to be braced against wind. Mara found that the ordinary task settled her better than discussing Everett's threats ever could. By late afternoon, the rust-dyed wool had dried. She carted it beside the stove while Jonah checked shoes, girths, and pack straps. The fibers caught at the rough places on her hands. She teased them apart, drawing order from tangles. At the table lay the evidence. Gideon's ledger, the marriage agreement, tax receipts, survey correspondence, Everett's envelope, and Pruitt's county notice. Mara had made 3 copies of the essential passages in her own hand. One set went into an oilskin packet beneath her shirt. One remained in the cabin under a loose hearthstone. Jonah carried the originals in a leather case strapped flat beneath Cedar's saddle blanket. You expect theft, he observed. I expect men who call theft procedure. He nodded. Good. They left before sunrise. Pine Wells lay a long day northwest if the weather held, longer if the upper pass had snow. The trail climbed through stands of ponderosa and crossed open shelves where the land dropped away in red cliffs. Juniper moved carefully beneath Mara. Cedar carried Jonah and the document case. A pack mule followed with food, blankets, and feed. The cold sharpened every sound. Ice broke beneath hooves. Ravens called from the high trees. Once far below, a herd of elk crossed a meadow like smoke. Mara rode beside Jonah when the trail allowed. Did you always live on the mountain? She asked. No. He waited, leaving her free to continue or not. Where before? San Carlos, then Fort Grant. Then anywhere work paid enough to keep moving. Mara knew enough of agency life to hear what he had not said. Men in Red Willow spoke of reservations as though they were generous plots given to people who should be grateful. Gideon had called them pens. How did you get the ranch? Bought the first 40 acres from a widow whose sons had left. Added the upper meadow after 5 years. The town says you took it through a special government grant. The town prefers a story in which I did not earn it. Mara looked ahead. They preferred that story about me too. Jonah's eyes shifted toward her. Yes, at midday they stopped beside a spring. Mara unwrapped biscuits and venison. Jonah removed Cedar's saddle and inspected the hidden document case. Still there? She asked. Yes, you check often. Paper is more nervous than a horse. Mara smiled despite herself. Paper has reason. They camped that night below the pass in a stand of pines. Snow had begun to fall, light and dry. Jonah built a low fire shielded by stones while Mara melted snow and made cornmeal dumplings and broth. They had only one small canvas shelter. Jonah stretched it between 2 trees for Mara and prepared his bed beneath a pine. No, she said. He looked at her. The temperature will fall below freezing. Yes. The shelter is wide enough for 2 bedrolls. He said nothing. Mara understood the question inside his silence. She had invited him into the cabin under specific terms. The mountain camp required new terms. We sleep on opposite sides of the fire, she said. The rifle remains between us. If you snore, I will throw snow at you. I do not snore. All men say that because they are asleep when the evidence occurs. Jonah considered, agreed. They arranged the bedrolls beneath the canvas, leaving an arm's length of ground and the rifle between them. Snow whispered against the shelter. The fire cast a red pulse across the ceiling. Mara lay on her side, facing the flames. Did my father ever speak about Everett to you? She asked. No. You said he knew the difference between water and fences. He wrote that Everett wanted authority before trust. I keep wondering whether everyone saw what I did not. Not everyone. You? I met Hale twice, and he looked at Cedar's teeth before he looked at me. Mara waited. He asked the horse's price. When I said Cedar was not for sale, he asked what difficulty had made me sentimental. That sounds like him. Your father did not tell me his concerns. If he had, I would not have known what you wished. Mara pulled the blanket higher. I wished to be chosen. The confession entered the cold air and remained there. Everett had courted her after Gideon's illness worsened. He arrived with oranges in winter, books from Tucson, and questions about crop yield disguised as admiration. Red Willow praised him for overlooking Mara's rough hands and plain habits. For the first time, she had been treated as though a future could include more than endurance. I thought marriage might make the town stop waiting for me to fail, she said. I thought it would give the farm another pair of hands. Jonah shifted a piece of wood with a stick. Hale's hands, that should have warned me. You wanted the offer to be true. Yes, that is not a crime. It was nearly expensive enough to be one. Snow thickened around the shelter. Mara watched it accumulate along the edge. What did you want? She asked. When you bought the first 40 acres. Jonah's face was half in shadow. A door no one else could order me through. The answer was so close to her own desire that she looked away. And now, a roof that holds. Horses that trust me. Work worth doing. Nothing else? His gaze rested on the fire. Wanting is easy. Building is slower. Mara felt heat rise into her face despite the cold. She did not ask what he meant. In the night she woke to silence. The fire had dropped low. Snow pressed the canvas inward. Jonah was gone from his bedroll. Mara sat up. A shape moved beyond the shelter. She reached for the rifle, then heard Cedar snort. Jonah stood beside the horses, tightening the windbreak after one of the ropes loosened. He saw her watching. Go back to sleep, he said. Is anything wrong? Only weather. She lay down again. Minutes later he returned, brushed snow from his coat, and settled across the rifle. He did not know Mara remained awake. She listened to his breathing. He did not snore. Pine Wells appeared the next afternoon, a cluster of low adobe buildings around a spring-fed pond. Unlike Red Willow, it had no raised chapel or grand false fronts. Smoke rose from cook fires. Mexican freighters, Apache families, miners, and ranchers moved along the same muddy road without pretending they lived in separate worlds. Amos Bell occupied a small house behind the old survey office. He was 80, nearly blind in one eye, and furious at being interrupted while repairing a clock. Brass gears covered his table. 3 cats watched from the window. Mara Ellison, he said after she introduced herself. Gideon's girl. I am 26. You were a girl when I met you. You were already old. Amos barked a laugh. Yes, you are his. He recognized Jonah and invited them inside without hesitation. Mara laid out the papers. Amos read slowly through a magnifying lens, pausing over Gideon's final note. I witnessed this, he said. Hale wanted the spring rights assigned upon engagement. Gideon refused. Said a promise was not a transfer. Would you testify in Prescott, if necessary? Amos leaned back. I dislike Prescott, so did my father. That is not sufficient reason to go. Mara waited. The old man looked at Everett's letter, then at the county order. Crowell's signed this? Yes, he has wanted that creek for 10 years. The bank plans a freight road through Saltwash. A mill at your spring would control water for every team between Red Willow and the Copper camps. Mara felt the shape of the scheme change. This is not only Everett. No. Hale is vain enough to think he invented greed, but Crowell and Harrow's bank have been drawing lines across your land since Gideon fell sick. Jonah's face remained still. Do you have copies? Amos pointed toward a cabinet top drawer. County road proposals, preliminary mill leases, letters asking whether the patent could be challenged for insufficient residence after Gideon's death. Mara opened the drawer. There were 12 documents. One letter from Everett to Bank President Samuel Harrow promised that marital consolidation would remove the need for condemnation proceedings. Another estimated the value of the creek once Mara's separate ownership ended. A note in Crowell's hand suggested delaying the final county certification until after the wedding. Mara read without moving. The abandonment at the chapel had not been a sudden act of cowardice alone. Everett had left because the delayed certification threatened the timetable of a larger transaction. He had been expected to acquire her land by marriage, not merely for himself but for the bank and the magistrate. Her life had been an obstacle on a map. Jonah stood beside her, close enough that the warmth of his coat reached her sleeve but not touching. Amos watched them. You will need certified copies, my testimony. Proof Hale fled. Proof the ceremony did not occur. And proof you continued residence or were prevented from returning by unlawful entry. We have witnesses to the chapel, Mara said. Witnesses who dislike you. Dislike does not erase eyes. It can damage memory. Jonah spoke. The Reverend's son saw her at the ranch the next day and carried Hale's letter. Pruitt and Niles entered the property before any judgment. Amos looked at him. Will the boy speak? I think he will, Mara said. Then get his statement before his father remembers who donates coal to the church. Mara gathered the papers. Can you certify these today? Amos looked toward the fading light. No. Her heart dropped. I can certify them properly tomorrow, he said. Today I can only do it badly. He gave them his spare room, which contained one narrow bed and a chair. Jonah looked at the chair. Mara sighed. You will sleep on the floor. I was planning to. And I am informing you that your plan is acceptable. Amos, listening from the hallway, muttered, Courtship has become very procedural. Mara nearly dropped the document box. Jonah's expression did not change, but his ears darkened. We are not courting, Mara said. Then the paperwork will be simpler, Amos replied and shut his door. Later, Mara lay awake in the narrow bed, while Jonah slept on the floor beneath the window. The old surveyor's words should have embarrassed her, only because they were foolish. Instead, they had frightened her because they were not entirely foolish anymore. By noon the next day, Amos Bell had stamped 6 certified copies and sworn an affidavit before the Pine Wells postmaster, who also served as notary. The old surveyor signed slowly but with a hand steadier than his age suggested. I certify that Gideon Ellison rejected any transfer of land, water, crop, livestock, or mineral rights before a completed legal marriage and the separate written consent of Mara Ellison, he read aloud. I further certify that Everett Hale understood and accepted this condition. He sanded the ink. Will that hold? Mara asked. It will hold better than Crowell's courage. Amos prepared a second statement describing the bank's road plan and the letters he had kept. He made Mara take the originals. Why did you save them? She asked. Surveyors learn that men become honest only after they believe the map is gone. Before Mara left, he placed Gideon's watch on the table and opened the back with a thumbnail. The regulator is running fast, he said. It kept time yesterday. It gains almost 4 minutes a day. Mara stared at him. She had relied on the watch's precision through droughts, tax deadlines, and the chapel hour. Can you fix it? I can. She hesitated, then handed it over. Amos bent above the tiny mechanism. Your father adjusted this himself. Poorly. He was not poor at anything. Everyone is poor at something. Love does not improve machinery. Jonah stood near the door, and Mara could feel his amusement without looking. Amos cleaned a gear, reset the regulator, and closed the case. There. Now it will tell you the truth instead of the truth you expected. Mara slipped the watch into her pocket. On the road out, she said, "You enjoyed that." Jonah rode beside her. "Which part?" "Amos insulting my father." He corrected a watch. "He insulted him while doing it. Gideon would have approved." "You cannot know that." "No." The quiet admission made her laugh. They rode south beneath a clear sky, carrying evidence enough to threaten a bank, a merchant, and a magistrate. Yet Mara's fear did not disappear. It changed form. The closer they came to Red Willow, the more clearly she understood what power would do to protect itself. Near sunset saw smoke above the mountain ridge. Not chimney smoke. A thin black line rose from the direction of Jonah's meadow. He urged Cedar forward. Mara did not need instruction. Juniper followed at a run. The trail blurred beneath them. Branches struck Mara's sleeves. The pack mule labored behind. They reached the meadow to find the north haystack burning. Flames moved through the dry grass in fast, orange sheets. Jonah jumped from Cedar before the horse stopped. Mara dropped from Juniper and ran to the water trough. They formed no plan aloud. Jonah dragged burning sections away with a long rake while Mara filled buckets and threw water at the base. Smoke clawed her throat. Sparks landed in her hair. The horses screamed from the corral. The fire had been set on the leeward side, where wind would carry it toward the barn. Mara cut the corral gate rope and drove the horses into the upper meadow. Jonah broke apart the stack with the rake, creating gaps the flames could not cross. They worked until darkness came and the last red edges hissed beneath mud. Half the hay was gone. Jonah stood in blackened snow, his face streaked with soot. Mara coughed into her sleeve. "Accident?" He walked to the far side of the stack and picked up a broken bottle. The cloth wick was still tied around its neck. No. They searched the property by lantern. The cabin had not been entered. The barn door bore a fresh mark where someone had tested the bar. Near the lower trail they found 2 sets of horse tracks. One horse dragged its left hind foot. "Everett's roan," Mara said. The shoe was always uneven. Jonah crouched beside the print. "He came while we were gone. He knew where." Someone told him. "Owen? No." Mara thought of Red Willow, of Lydia Harrow, the bank, Pruitt, Niles, Reverend Price. The scheme now had fire in it. "We should go to the county office tonight," she said. "Closed. To the sheriff. Crowell appoints him. Then Prescott. The upper road is snowed in after dark. We lose the horses or the papers." Mara struck the broken bottle against a fence post. Glass shattered in her hand. A shard cut her palm. Jonah caught her wrist, not hard, but fast. "Let go," he did. Blood welled along the base of her thumb. Mara stared at it, ashamed of the loss of control. Jonah took a clean cloth from his pocket and set it on the post, rather than wrapping her hand himself. "They burned your winter feed because of me," she said. "They burned it because they are afraid of paper. You may lose horses. I will buy hay. With what? The North Trail closes soon. I will cut cottonwood browse and trade hides. This is my fight. It reached my fence. Now it is also mine." Mara pressed the cloth to her palm. "That is what I feared." Jonah's eyes narrowed slightly. "What?" "That every kindness becomes a chain. You help me, then your hay burns. Next it will be the barn. Then the cabin. One day you will look at me and see the cost." He was silent. Mara wanted him to deny cost existed. She would not have believed him. Instead he said, "I saw the price before I offered my hand. The meadow smelled of smoke and wet ash. You did not see this. I saw men enjoying cruelty because they believed no one would stop them. Men like that do not become gentle when opposed. What if the price rises? Then I decide again. You make it sound simple. No, I make it mine." Mara looked at the cloth darkening in her hand. Jonah stepped closer, stopping before the distance became an intrusion. "You are not the fire," he said. "Do not carry the guilt of the man who lit it." Her eyes burned worse than the smoke. He took the lantern and began checking the horses. Mara followed. They spent the night moving unburned hay into the barn and cutting emergency feed. At dawn, Jonah rode to a neighboring Navajo family's winter camp and traded 2 cured elk hides for a wagon load of grass hay. Mara remained at the ranch, loaded the rifle, and watched the lower trail. Near noon, a single rider appeared. Owen Price came hard up the slope, waving before he entered range. Mara lowered the rifle. He brought a signed statement from his mother, confirming that Everett's mercantile had been cleared before the wedding hour. Reverend Price had refused to sign anything, but his wife had seen Everett's wagon on the north road at dawn. "Mrs. Harrow knows I came," Owen said. "She told father I was being corrupted. Were you?" Mara asked. I had Stu. A grave beginning. He smiled, then grew serious. Everett returned last night. He met with Crowell and Mr. Harrow. They are coming here. How many? I heard 4 names, maybe more. They have an order. What kind? I do not know. Father said the law must be respected. Did he read it? No. Mara looked toward the barn. Jonah was not yet back. When will they arrive? Before evening. Owen's horse was exhausted. Mara could not send him down immediately. She put him to work carrying hay. Jonah returned an hour later with the wagon. He listened to Owen, then read Mrs. Price's statement. We should leave, Mara said. Take the papers to Prescott before they arrive. Jonah looked at the sky. They will expect that. So? They will place men on the lower trail. The East Ridge? Too steep for the pack mule, but a rider can cross. Mara understood. You go with the originals. You go. It is my claim. And they will follow you. They want me more than the papers. Yes, that is why you should carry them. Jonah's jaw tightened. Mara stepped closer. You said standing beside someone is a choice. Let me make one. Everett believes I am helpless without you. Let him come here and discover I can keep him occupied. This is not a game. I know. He may be armed. So am I. Owen stays? If he chooses. The boy swallowed. I will. Jonah looked from Mara to the papers, then toward the East Ridge. Prescott is 2 days by the upper route, he said. I can reach the federal relay station at Black Mesa by midnight. They can telegraph the registry and the territorial judge. A filed protest freezes any county transfer, then go. I return before dawn if the trail holds. If it does not, you lock the cabin and use the ravine behind the smokehouse if they try to burn you out. Mara nodded. Jonah placed the original documents beneath his coat. He checked the rifle, saddled Cedar, and packed only water and dried meat. At the porch, he stopped. Mara stood 1 step above him. For the first time since the chapel, she wanted to touch him without needing support. She did not know what permission looked like between them. Jonah seemed equally uncertain. Mara took the strip of white cotton from her hair, the last clean piece of the wedding dress, and tied it around his wrist. So I know it returned, she said. His eyes held hers. It will. The promise frightened her more than if he had sworn never to fail. Jonah mounted and rode east. Mara watched until the pines closed behind him. Then she turned to Owen. Bring every full water bucket into the cabin, she said. After that, we prepare the porch for guests. Mara moved the kitchen table against the inside wall beneath the front window. On it, she arranged the certified copies, Gideon's ledger, Everett's envelope, and the statements from Amos Bell and Mrs. Price. She loaded the revolver but left it in the drawer where she could reach it without displaying it. A visible weapon would give Crowell an excuse to call her dangerous. A hidden one remained a choice. Owen filled buckets and placed them near the stove, the rear door, and the loft ladder. Mara soaked 2 blankets in the trough and left them in a tub on the porch, in case another bottle came through the window. She moved the horses into the ravine and opened the far gate so they could run into timber if frightened. Should I have a gun? Owen asked. Can you use one? No. Then no. I could learn. Not before supper. The boy accepted the answer. At 3 in the afternoon, riders appeared below the meadow. There were 5. Everett rode first on the roan with the dragging hind foot. He wore a dark wool coat too fine for the trail and gloves that had never held a shovel. Magistrate Crowell rode beside him, round and red-faced, with a leather document tube strapped across his back. Samuel Harrow followed in a fur-collared coat. Pruitt and Niles came last. They did not see Owen. Mara had sent him to the loft with instructions to listen and remain out of sight unless called. The riders stopped near the burned haystack. Everett looked at the blackened ground, and satisfaction crossed his face before he concealed it. Mara stood on the porch in canvas trousers, a rust-colored wool shawl, and her own work boots. Her hair was braided. The white strip was gone from it. Everett stared as though she had committed an offense against his property. Mara, he said. She did not answer. Crowell dismounted with effort and removed the document tube. Miss Ellison, we are here under lawful county authority, then read the authority aloud. He frowned. You may inspect it after entry. No one enters. Everett swung down from the roan. He held a riding crop, tapping it against his boot. This performance has gone far enough. Mara looked at the crop. You have always preferred performances when you choose the audience. His jaw tightened. I came to correct a misunderstanding. You left Red Willow before dawn with your strongbox. Business required travel. Your clerk told 3 people you were closing the store. Niles looked away. Everett climbed the first porch step. We can discuss private matters inside. We have no private matters. We have a signed marriage agreement. We have an uncompleted ceremony, because you humiliated me by leaving with him." A laugh escaped Mara, quiet and astonished. "You were already gone." Everett's face colored. "I delayed. You chose scandal rather than patience. I waited 1 hour and 14 minutes. For the first time, the repaired watch in her pocket felt less like a wound than a witness." Crowell unrolled a document. "The county recognizes substantial performance of a marital agreement when one party has incurred material reliance. Mr. Hale financed improvements to the Ellison property in expectation of marriage. Your flight creates grounds for equitable compensation. Which improvements? The pump, fencing, agricultural equipment, and store credit." Mara reached through the open window and took a paper from the table. The pump was paid from account number 31 at the Federal Assay Bank. The wire came from Chavez Brothers in Pine Wells. The plow was never purchased. Everett extended $32 in store credit, of which $27.14 were repaid before my father died. The remaining $4.86 were deducted twice from peach deliveries. She held up Gideon's ledger. "Would you like the page numbers?" Harrow's eyes narrowed. Crowell recovered. "Those figures require review. They required review before you signed an order." Everett climbed another step. "Enough. You have been confused by a man who wants your land for himself." Mara's voice went cold. "Jonah owned his ranch before you learned the word acreage. He has filled your mind with grievance. He is not here." Everett looked toward the barn, surprised. Mara noticed. "You expected him," she said. "I expected the trespasser responsible for holding my intended wife. No one is holding me. You are dressed in his clothes. I was abandoned in a storm wearing lace." His gaze traveled over her, making the borrowed garments feel suddenly exposed. Mara refused to fold her arms. Everett lowered his voice. "Come down, I will forgive the disgrace. We will return to town, marry tonight, and put this ugliness behind us." The old version of Mara might have heard generosity. Now she heard the inventory of control. "Come down, return, marry, forget." "No." His crop stopped tapping. "Mara, no. You are angry. Yes. You are not thinking clearly. I have never thought more clearly." He climbed the final step. Mara did not retreat. "You owe me," he said. "For what?" "For choosing you when no one else would." The words entered the air with such naked cruelty that even Pruitt shifted below. Mara felt no shock, only confirmation. "You chose a creek," she said. "You tolerated the woman standing on it." Everett reached for her arm. Mara stepped aside. His hand closed on empty air. "Do not touch me." Crowell rolled the order again. "Mr. Hale is entitled to retrieve property purchased for the marital household." "What property?" "Furniture, provisions, and livestock subject to the agreement. This is Jonah Nez's ranch. Then he may file a claim afterward." Harrow dismounted. Crowell, stop debating her. Serve the order. The magistrate handed the paper to Pruitt. Pruitt approached the stairs. Mara called toward the open cabin door. "Owen!" The boy descended from the loft and stepped onto the porch. Every man below froze. Reverend Price's son held a pencil and a bound notebook. "I have written the names, time, and statements," he said, his voice unsteady but audible. "Mrs. Ellison asked that I witness service." "Miss Ellison," Everett snapped. Owen looked at him. "Yes, sir." Crowell's face darkened. "Boy, your father will hear of this. He usually does." Mara nearly smiled. She took the order from Pruitt without allowing him onto the porch. The county seal was real. The language authorized temporary possession of the Ellison farm and associated movable assets under the control of Mara Ellison. It did not name Jonah's ranch, its horses, its stores, or the cabin. She held it up. "This grants no authority here." Crowell said, "You are controlling these assets through your residence. I have resided here for 4 days. Then the court will determine. The court may determine later. Today your own paper limits you to my farm." Pruitt glanced at Crowell. He did not like being made the instrument of an obvious trespass in front of a literate witness, so stepped forward. "We did not ride half a day to be delayed by grammar." "No," Mara said. "You rode because your mill lease depends on my marriage." The meadow went still. Everett looked at Harrow. Crowell's face emptied. Mara placed Amos Bell's certified copy on the porch rail. "I have your letters. I have the proposed freight road. I have the note instructing the county clerk to delay my certification until after the ceremony." Harrow recovered first. "Forgeries. Amos Bell kept the originals. He is senile. He signed an affidavit before the Pine Wells notary." Crowell's hand went to his collar. Everett turned on him. "You said those papers were destroyed." There it was. Owen's pencil moved furiously. Harrow said, "Be quiet." Mara looked at the boy. "Did you hear Mr. Hale?" "Yes, ma'am." Everett realized his mistake. He lunged toward the porch. Mara opened the drawer and brought out the revolver. The barrel pointed at the floorboards in front of his boots. "Step down," he stopped. "You would shoot me?" "I would prefer not to damage Jonah's porch." Pruitt choked on a laugh and converted it into a cough. Everett raised the crop. "You ungrateful." The report of a rifle rolled across the meadow. It did not come from Mara. A bullet struck the ground 6 feet to the right of Everett's boot, throwing up dirt. Everyone turned. Jonah sat on cedar at the edge of the clearing. Snow dusted his hat and shoulders. The white strip of cloth remained tied around his wrist. He lowered the rifle, levered a fresh round into the chamber, and rode forward. Mara's relief was so strong that it felt like pain. He had returned. Jonah stopped below the porch and looked at the 5 men. The first shot marked distance. No one asked about the second. He dismounted and handed Mara a folded telegram. The paper bore the seal of the territorial land judge. By order of the Federal Registry, all county action affecting the Ellison patent was stayed pending investigation of fraud, coercion, and unlawful interference. Any removal of property or attempt to compel marriage would be treated as contempt and referred to the territorial marshal. Mara read the words aloud. Crowell sank slightly in the saddle as though his bones had softened. Harrow said, "A telegraph is not a judgment." "No," Jonah replied. "It is notice." He produced a second paper. The marshal at Black Mesa signed receipt of Bell's affidavit, Gideon's ledger extracts, Mrs. Price's statement, and the Hale-Harrow correspondence. Copies were sent to Prescott before dawn. Everett's face turned gray. Jonah looked at the blackened haystack. "I also filed a complaint for arson." "You cannot prove," Everett began. Mara held up the broken bottle wrapped in cloth. "Niles sold that brand of lamp oil. The bottle carries the mercantile stamp." Niles took one involuntary step backward. Everett turned. "You fool." Niles looked at Pruitt, then at Crowell. "He said we were only frightening them." Owen's pencil stopped. Harrow closed his eyes. Mara felt the entire structure begin to crack, not with a dramatic collapse, but with one frightened man deciding not to be the only one punished. "Who said?" she asked. Niles swallowed. "Mr. Hale." Everett struck him across the face with the riding crop. The act happened fast. Jonah moved faster. He caught Everett's wrist before the crop could rise again. He did not wrench or twist. He simply held. Everett pulled. Nothing changed. "Release me," he hissed. Jonah took the crop from his hand and dropped it into the mud. Then he released him. Everett staggered backward, humiliated by the absence of struggle. Mara lowered the revolver. "You will leave." Crowell attempted dignity. "This matter will be handled through proper channels." "It has entered proper channels," Mara said. "That is why you are afraid." Harrow mounted without assistance. Pruitt followed. Niles pressed a hand to his cheek and avoided Everett. Everett remained below the porch. "You think this man will marry you?" he asked Mara. His voice was low and vicious. "You think Red Willow will forget what you have done? When he tires of playing protector, you will crawl back to people who know what you are." Mara looked at Jonah. He stood in the mud, soot still under his nails from the burned hay, snow melting along his shoulders, the white strip tied around his wrist. He did not answer for her. He never did. Mara looked back at Everett. "I know what I am," she said. "That is why I will never crawl to you." Everett mounted the roan and jerked the reins. The horse's bad shoe struck unevenly as he followed the others down the trail. Owen waited until they disappeared. Then he released a breath that seemed to empty his entire body. "Did I write enough?" he asked. Mara looked at the pages. "You wrote everything." Jonah picked up Everett's crop and broke it over his knee. He threw the pieces into the burned hay. The territorial marshal reached Red Willow 3 days later. By then, the story had outrun every writer. Niles had given a written statement in exchange for protection. Pruitt, eager to become a witness rather than a defendant, admitted that Crowell ordered the Ellison farm inventory before any lawful judgment. Mrs. Price sent Owen's notebook to the marshal with her own account of Everett's dawn departure. Amos Bell arrived in a hired wagon, complaining loudly about the road and carrying a metal box of original correspondence on his lap. Mara rode into town beside Jonah. She had considered refusing. Red Willow had no right to demand her presence after what happened on the chapel porch, but the federal hearing concerned her land, her name, and the work of her father's hands. She would not let men speak those things into the record while she remained hidden. She wore a plain brown work dress. Beneath the rust-colored wool shawl, woven from the mountain fleece. The dress allowed a full breath. Its skirt cleared her boots. Gideon's repaired watch rested in her pocket and kept exact time. Jonah wore his canvas coat. The white strip remained tied around his wrist, now gray at the edges. The hearing took place in the county registry, because the courthouse was too small for the crowd. Lydia Harrow stood near the front beside her husband. She did not carry her parasol. Her face looked thinner than it had on the wedding day, but her posture remained rigid. Reverend Price and his wife occupied opposite ends of a bench. Owen sat behind his mother with the notebook on his knees. Everett stood at a table with an attorney from Prescott. He had regained his polished clothes and carefully arranged hair. From a distance, he looked respectable again. Mara found that appearance no longer confused her. The territorial marshal, Ruth Calder, was a narrow-shouldered woman in her 40s with sun-darkened skin and a revolver worn openly at her hip. She asked questions without wasting words. Amos testified first. He described Gideon's refusal to transfer the property before marriage. He identified the notes in the ledger and the letters concerning the road and mill. Everett's attorney attempted to discredit him because of age. "How old are you, Mr. Bell?" "Old enough to remember when lawyers ask useful questions." The crowd laughed. Marshal Calder did not, but she allowed the answer. "Is your eyesight reliable?" "No. That is why I use a magnifying lens." "Could you have mistaken Mr. Hale's handwriting?" Amos looked at Everett. "I could mistake his face. His handwriting leans right, crosses every second T too high, and makes the capital H like a ladder missing a rung. I surveyed for 43 years. Men lie, marks remain." The attorney sat down. Mrs. Price testified that Everett's store was being emptied before dawn. Owen read from his notebook, including Everett's statement about the papers being destroyed, and Niles's admission that the fire was meant to frighten Mara and Jonah. When Mara's turn came, the room changed. She walked to the front alone. Jonah remained where he was. Marshal Calder asked about the courtship, the agreement, the chapel, the county entry, the fire, and Everett's demand that she return to marry him. Mara answered plainly. She did not decorate her pain for the crowd and did not minimize it to preserve anyone's comfort. "Did Mr. Nez remove you from the chapel against your will?" the attorney asked. "No." "Were you emotionally distressed?" "Yes." "Then is it possible you were not capable of consent?" Mara looked at him. "I was capable of recognizing an offered hand." "Did Mr. Nez influence your decision to reject Mr. Hale's request for reconciliation?" "No." "You stayed in his home?" "Yes." "Alone with him?" The implication moved through the room. Mara saw Lydia Harrow lean forward. She answered without lowering her eyes. "He gave me the bed, the key, and a door that locked from the inside. He slept in the barn until I invited him to use the floor beside the stove." A silence followed. The attorney changed direction. "Mr. Hale contends that he left Red Willow due to urgent business and always intended to return. He took his cash, valuables, account books, and best horse. Intention is difficult to prove. So is respect. Absence made both clearer. Even Marshal Calder's mouth shifted. Everett's attorney called his client. Everett described himself as a man betrayed by a difficult woman under the influence of an outsider. He claimed the mill plan was a future investment meant to benefit Mara. He denied ordering the fire. He said Niles lied out of fear. Then Marshal Calder placed the original letter from Everett to Harrow before him. "Is this your handwriting?" He studied it. The missing rung H stared from the page. "It appears similar." "Read the final sentence." His face tightened. "Read it." Everett spoke through clenched teeth. "Once the marriage is solemnized, Mara's separate objection will no longer prevent consolidation of the water rights." The room became very quiet. Marshal Calder took the letter back. "You did not write that the marriage would remove a legal obstacle. You wrote that it would remove her objection." Everett's attorney rose. "Argument. This is an administrative fraud inquiry. Counsel, sit down." He sat. Crowell was questioned next. His answers contradicted his own clerk, his dated notices, and the postmark on Everett's letter. Samuel Harrow admitted the road project existed, but called it speculative. When shown a draft loan agreement secured by the Ellison Creek, he blamed Everett. Lydia Harrow watched her husband's respectability peel away one document at a time. Mara expected satisfaction. What she felt was quieter. These people had seemed enormous when she stood above them in white lace. Now they looked like ordinary frightened bodies in expensive cloth. At 4:23, Marshal Calder issued her findings. The Ellison patent would proceed directly to federal certification without further county review. All claims arising from the marriage agreement were void because no marriage had been solemnized and because evidence showed fraudulent inducement. Crowell was suspended pending territorial charges for abuse of office and conspiracy to interfere with a federal claim. Harrow's bank accounts related to the road project were frozen. Everett was ordered to surrender his mercantile records and remain within the territory pending investigation of arson, coercion, and fraud. The marshal struck the table once with the flat of her hand. Miss Ellison's land is not security for any man's disappointment. The sentence entered the official record. Outside, freezing rain had begun. The crowd spilled into the street, no longer organized by confidence. People who had watched Mara on the chapel porch avoided her eyes. Others approached with apologies shaped to minimize their participation. "We did not know the full circumstances," Mrs. Harrow told us. "We assumed Everett had reason." Mara answered none of them. Everett emerged from the registry between the marshal's deputies. He was not under arrest, but his freedom had narrowed. His attorney carried the document case. Niles had already changed the mercantile lock under official supervision. Everett saw Mara and pulled away from the deputy. "You did this," he said. Mara stood beneath the registry awning. Rain darkened the street between them. "No," she said, "you did. I kept the papers." His face twisted. "You think a patent makes you safe? No, you will still be alone." Mara glanced at Jonah, who waited several feet away. "I was alone when I agreed to marry you," she said. "I am not alone now, even when no one stands beside me." Everett looked at Jonah. "She will turn on you too." Jonah's expression remained calm. "Then she will tell me to leave." "And you would?" "Yes." The answer seemed incomprehensible to Everett. A person who understood only possession could not imagine love containing an exit. The deputy guided him down the street. Near the chapel, 2 workers removed the Hale name from the mercantile sign. One iron hook broke. The wooden board fell into the mud and split. Samuel Harrow left through the side door. Lydia waited beneath the awning. For a moment, Mara and the older woman faced each other. Lydia looked at the rust shawl, the work boots, and the steady posture. "You have made enemies," she said. "I had them before. Now they have names. The town will not easily forget this humiliation." Mara thought of the chapel. "Neither will I." Lydia's mouth thinned. "You could have accepted help. You offered disappearance. We offered order. For whom?" Lydia had no answer that could survive being spoken aloud. Mrs. Price crossed the street and stood beside Mara. She did not apologize with words. She held out a wrapped loaf of bread and a small jar of apple butter. Mara accepted both. That was enough for the moment. Amos Bell climbed into his wagon, muttering about his cats. Owen helped him with the blanket. Marshal Calder returned to the registry to begin seizing records. Jonah and Mara walked to the livery. "You did not speak during my testimony," she said. "You did not need me to. I knew you were there, yes." Mara stopped beside Cedar. That mattered. Jonah met her eyes. "I know." She reached for the white strip around his wrist. He held still while she untied it. The cloth was stained with smoke, snow, and sweat. Mara folded it and placed it beside her father's watch. Some things deserved to be kept not because they were beautiful, but because they had returned. Winter reached the mountain in earnest before the federal seal arrived. Snow closed the upper trail and filled the meadow to the lower rails of the corral. Mara and Jonah rose in darkness, fed animals by lantern, broke ice in the trough, and carried wood until their shoulders ached. They rationed hay, cut cottonwood branches for browse, and repaired the north side of the barn where wind forced powder through the chinking. Nothing about victory made the stove feed itself. Mara loved that. The hearing had restored her claim, but daily work restored her body. She no longer woke counting the seconds until disaster. She woke listening for weather, the soft hiss of snowfall, the hard tapping that meant sleet, the deep silence that warned of extreme cold. Jonah moved his bedroll from beside the stove to the small loft after she told him the floor was becoming ridiculous. "The loft is warmer," she said. "Yes. And you are too large to sleep folded against a wall." "Yes, you may use the loft." He studied her with solemn attention. "Under what terms?" Mara pretended to consider. "You continue not to snore." "I do not. Unproven." He moved to the loft. The bed remained hers. The key stayed on the peg. Some nights when wind shook the roof, they spoke across the dark. Other nights they slept without a word. Trust did not arrive as a single surrender. It accumulated through repeated evidence. A mug placed near her hand before dawn, a knife sharpened and returned to the exact drawer, a gate closed after every use, a question asked before a touch. In December, the bay mare Belle colicked after eating frozen grass. Mara found her rolling in the stall and called Jonah. They worked for 6 hours, walking the mare through snow, warming oil, massaging the tight belly, and keeping her from throwing herself against the wall. Near midnight, Belle finally passed the obstruction and lowered her head to drink. Mara leaned against the stall, exhausted. Jonah stood beside her. His sleeve touched hers. Neither moved. "She will live," he said. Mara nodded. The barn lantern cast a soft circle around them. Beyond it, horses breathed in darkness. "Jonah, yes?" She turned her hand palm up between them. He looked down. Mara did not explain. She was tired of language being used to hide simple things. Jonah placed his hand in hers. His palm was broad, rough, warm despite the cold. He did not close his fingers until she closed hers first. They stood that way for a long time. It was not a rescue. It was not a debt. It was a choice made in a barn after hard work, witnessed only by a recovering mare and the slow fall of snow beyond the door. The federal packet arrived in January by a mail rider wearing 3 coats. Mara signed for it at the kitchen table. The patent was thick parchment, bordered in black, with the red seal of the United States Land Office impressed at the bottom. It named Mara Ellison as sole lawful owner of 160 acres, including the Spring Creek orchard, fields, structures, and all appurtenant water rights. No husband, no bank, no county condition. Her name alone. She traced the raised seal with one finger. Jonah stood near the stove, giving her the same quiet room he had offered while she grieved over Gideon's ledger. "It is done," she said. "Yes." Mara expected triumph. Instead, she felt a deep tenderness for the woman who had stood in white lace, believing a document and a husband were the only walls between her and ruin. She folded the patent and placed it in the oilskin case. "I should return to the farm in spring." Jonah's hand paused on the stove door. The silence that followed was different from all their others. "The orchard will need pruning," Mara continued. "The south fence should be reset before floodwater comes. Belle knows the pasture. The house is mine." "Yes." She looked at him. "You agree very quickly." "It is true." "That is not what I asked." "You did not ask." Mara folded her arms. "Then I am asking now, what do you want?" The question remained between them while the stove snapped. Jonah closed the draft vent. He walked to the table and sat across from her. "I want you to return to your land because you choose it," he said. "Not because you think staying here would make you beholden. And if I choose to stay, I would be glad. That is all?" "No." He reached into his coat and placed a small object on the table. It was not a ring, it was a key. Mara recognized the hand-forged iron key to the cabin door. "You already gave me this," she said, "for one night. And now, for as long as you want it." Her throat tightened. Jonah continued, his voice steady, though his hand was not entirely still. "I will not ask for your creek. I will not ask you to move your patent, change your name, or place your accounts under mine. I will not promise the mountain will be easy. I can promise I will speak before I decide something that changes your life, and I will listen when you say no." Mara looked at the key. "What are you asking? That we build one life without erasing either one we had before?" Outside, snow slid from the roof with a heavy sigh. Mara remembered Everett's proposal in the Mercantile. He had presented a ring across a polished counter and spoken of security, respectability, and the future of the Ellison land. He had never once asked what she wished to keep. Jonah offered no ring, no audience, and no ownership. He offered terms that left her whole. "Would we live here?" she asked. "Part of the year if you want. And the valley farm? We repair it in spring, plant the orchard, use the creek. You would come down? When work like Red Willow. Yes, so do I. Yes." Mara turned the key over. "And if we disagree, we will. That is not comforting. It is honest. What if I tell you to leave a room? I leave. What if you believe I am wrong? I tell you. What if I remain wrong? You remain free." The answer broke the final locked place inside her. Mara reached across the table. This time she took his hand without hesitation. "Yes," she said. Jonah's fingers closed around hers. His relief was visible only in the lowering of his shoulders, but Mara had learned to read him. "You should know," she added, "that I intend to replace the south roof at the farm, expand the orchard, and refuse Harrow's Road even if the bank survives. I expected worse. I also want 2 more mares, a proper wool loom, and a stove that does not smoke when the wind turns east. The stove can be fixed. You have said that for a month. It requires a new cap, then acquire one." Jonah's mouth curved. Mara rose, came around the table, and stopped in front of him. "May I?" she asked. He knew what she meant. "Yes." She placed one hand against his cheek and kissed him. The kiss was gentle, almost uncertain, because neither of them had reached it through practiced courtship. Jonah did not pull her closer until Mara's other hand rested on his shoulder. Then he stood and held her with care, as though strength meant knowing how little force was necessary. When they parted, Mara kept her forehead against his. "No chapel porch," she said. No crowd. No, Amos will complain if we do not invite him. He will complain if we do. Owen and his mother, yes. And the papers will state that my land remains mine. They will. Your ranch remains yours. Yes, what becomes ours?" Jonah looked around the cabin, the table scarred by work, the shelves holding both sets of ledgers, the wool shawl over Mara's shoulders, the stove they had fed together. "What we build after," he said. They married in early spring beneath the cottonwoods at the Ellison farm. There was no white dress. Mara wore brown wool and the rust shawl. Jonah wore a clean dark shirt and the canvas coat because the morning remained cold. Amos Bell served as witness and complained about the mud. Owen stood beside his mother. Marshall Calder happened to be passing through Red Willow and signed the record with a smile she tried to hide. Reverend Price performed the brief ceremony after Mara required him to read the property terms aloud. The Ellison patent remained solely hers. The Nez Ranch remained solely Jonah's. Neither spouse assumed authority over the other's property, earnings, contracts, or movement. What they acquired together would be jointly held and could not be sold without both signatures. When the Reverend finished, Amos said, "Best marriage agreement I have ever seen." "Because you did not draft it," Mara replied. "Because it might prevent future work for lawyers." Jonah gave Mara the cabin key again, this time before witnesses. She gave him a new halter she had sewn for cedar, stamped on the inside with two small marks, an E and an N, separate but joined by one line of leather. They planted 6 peach trees that afternoon. The town did not transform. Some people continued to whisper. Lydia Harrow moved to Tucson after the bank failed. Crowell lost his office and spent a year arguing appeals. Everett sold what remained of the mercantile to pay legal costs and left the territory under supervision after pleading guilty to fraud and property damage. No grand punishment could return the hour Mara spent beneath the chapel bell, but she no longer needed one. The creek continued to flow whether Red Willow approved of her or not. In summer, Mara and Jonah restored the valley house. In autumn, they drove the horses back to the mountain. They built a loom near the north window and replaced the stove cap. The new cap stopped the smoke, though Jonah waited several weeks before admitting Mara had been right about the design. Years later, the chapel still stood above the street. Travelers sometimes heard a version of the abandoned bride story. In town tellings, Jonah rode in like a figure from a legend and carried Mara away. The story made him the hero because people found it easier to understand rescue than respect. That was not how Mara remembered it. She remembered a gloved hand offered without a claim. She remembered choosing the first stair. She remembered cutting the dress herself. At the end of each day, Gideon's watch rested on the cabin shelf beside the iron key. It no longer measured how long a man had failed to arrive. It measured bread rising, water boiling, mares laboring, storms passing, and 2 people returning from different fields to the same lighted door. The watch kept true time, so did they.